June 1945. Halifax Harbor, Nova Scotia. 7:14 a.m. The transport ship groaned against the dock, its hull scraping concrete with a sound like a groan of relief. Below deck, in a cargo hold converted to temporary quarters, 47 boys sat on wooden benches and waited. They ranged in age from 14 to 17, too young to be called men, too old to be spared the uniform. They had been told they were being sent to a labor camp. They had been told Canadians were savages who would work them to death in frozen forests. They had been told many things, and in the chaos of Germany's collapse, they had believed all of it because believing was easier than confronting the void. The cargo door opened. Daylight poured in, harsh and clean, and the boys squinted against it. A voice called down in accented German, "Form 2 lines. Bring your kits. No running." They climbed the stairs into morning. The air was sharp with salt and diesel and something else, something green, alive, unfamiliar. The harbor spread before them, crowded with ships and cranes and longshoremen hauling cargo. Beyond the docks, the city rose up a hillside, wooden houses painted bright colors, church steeples, trees so thick they seemed to swallow the horizon. One boy, a former Hitler youth named Otto, whispered to the boy beside him, "Where are the ruins?" There were no ruins. The city was whole, untouched. As if the war had been a nightmare that ended at the ocean's edge. A Canadian officer in olive uniform approached. He was young, maybe 25, with a face that carried no malice, only exhaustion. He looked them over, counting silently, then nodded to himself. "Welcome to Canada," he said in German. "You'll be fed, processed, and transported to a holding facility. You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. You will be treated accordingly." Otto stared. Treated accordingly. Not beaten. Not starved. Not shot. Treated accordingly as if they were soldiers who had simply lost, rather than children who had been fed into a machine that chewed up everyone it touched. They expected brutality. The first word they heard was welcome. The boys had not always been soldiers. They had been students, apprentices, farm workers, children with futures that had been stolen by a war they had not started but had been taught to worship. Otto had joined the Hitler Youth at 10, not out of conviction but because every boy joined. By 12 he was attending camps where they marched and sang and learned to field strip rifles. By 15 he was firing those rifles at Soviet soldiers advancing through East Prussia. By 16 he was captured near Königsberg, packed into a boxcar with 200 other prisoners, and shipped west through a Germany that no longer existed. The journey had taken weeks. They had crossed through British-occupied zones, been transferred to American custody, then loaded onto a troopship bound for Canada. No one had explained why. Explanations were not part of the process. You simply moved when told to move, ate when given food, and tried not to think about what came next. Otto had thought about it constantly. He had heard stories, rumors passed among prisoners in whispered German, that the Canadians sent child soldiers to mines in the Arctic, that they worked you until your hands bled and then left you to freeze. He had also heard that Canadians were lenient, that their camps were clean, that they followed rules even when rules seemed like weakness. He did not know which stories to believe. So he believed the worst because the worst prepared you for anything. CTA, if this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. The boys were loaded onto trucks, canvas-covered transports with wooden benches, and driven through Halifax toward the train station. Otto sat near the tailgate, staring out at the city passing by. Children played in parks. Women pushed prams along sidewalks. Men in civilian clothes walked to work carrying lunch pails. Everything was normal. Aggressively, impossibly normal. Beside him, a boy named Franz, 16 from Bavaria, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a grenade accident, whispered, "This can't be real." "It's real," Otto said. "Then where's the war?" Otto had no answer. The war was everywhere in Germany, in the rubble, the refugees, the bodies still rotting in ditches because no one had time to bury them. But here, across an ocean, the war was invisible. It existed only in the presence of men in uniform and the cargo holds full of prisoners being shipped to unknown fates. At the train station they were fed for the first time since leaving the ship. Sandwiches, white bread, sliced ham, cheese, lettuce, and apples, red and crisp, handed out by Canadian soldiers who moved with efficient neutrality. Otto took his sandwich and stared at it. He had not seen white bread in 2 years. In Germany bread was black, dense, mixed with sawdust to stretch the flour. This bread was soft. It tasted like something from before the war, from a world he had almost forgotten existed. Franz bit into his apple and made a sound, half laugh, half sob. "They're feeding us," he said as if he could not believe his own words. Don't get used to it, Otto said. But his own hands were shaking as he ate. The train journey took 3 days. They traveled west through landscapes that seemed pulled from a dream, endless forests, lakes so clear you could see the stones at the bottom, farmland that stretched unbroken to horizons impossibly far. The train stopped occasionally at small stations where Canadian civilians stood on platforms and stared at the boys through the windows. Some looked curious. Some looked hostile. Most looked indifferent, as if trainloads of German prisoners were just another ordinary feature of the post-war world. At night, the boys slept in their seats, heads lolling against windows or shoulders, too exhausted to stay awake despite the fear. Otto lay curled against the wall and listened to the clatter of wheels on rails and thought about his mother. He had not heard from her since January. The last letter had been postmarked from Berlin, written in her careful script. The bombs come every night now. We go to the cellar and wait. Your father has not returned from the front. I pray for you both. Otto did not know if she was alive. He did not know if his father was alive. He did not know if the house he had grown up in still existed, or if it was just another pile of bricks indistinguishable from the thousands of other piles that used to be homes. He thought, if I survive this, I will find her. If she survives, I will go home. But he did not believe either thing was possible. They arrived at the camp on a gray afternoon in late June. It was located in northern Ontario, surrounded by forests so dense it felt like a wall. The camp itself was orderly, rows of wooden barracks painted olive drab, a mess hall, a recreation building, watchtowers at the corners with guards who looked more bored than vigilant. Barbed wire encircled the perimeter, but the wire seemed almost decorative, a formality rather than a true barrier. Where would they run? There was nothing but trees for hundreds of miles. The boys were processed in shifts. Names recorded, photographs taken, medical examinations conducted by doctors who spoke no German but communicated through gestures and a translator who seemed perpetually exhausted. Otto stood in line, stripped to his underwear, and allowed a doctor to examine him. The doctor's hands were gentle. He noted Otto's malnutrition, his scabies, the badly healed fracture in his left wrist. He made notes on a clipboard and moved to the next boy without comment. After the examination, Otto was issued new clothes, trousers, a shirt, underwear, socks, boots, all clean, all in reasonable condition. He was also given a towel, a bar of soap, a toothbrush and a tube of toothpaste. He held the toothpaste and stared at it. It had been so long since he had brushed his teeth that the concept felt abstract, like something from a life he no longer lived. A guard led them to the showers. A communal room with multiple shower heads, hot water that came from pipes and smelled of chlorine. Otto stood under the spray and watched the dirt of months wash away, swirling down the drain in brown spirals. Around him, other boys were doing the same, their bodies skeletal, their faces hollow, their eyes distant. No one spoke. What was there to say? The first meal in the camp was served at 6 o'clock. The boys filed into the mess hall, a large room with long tables and benches, and sat in silence, unsure of the protocol. Then the food arrived. Beef stew, potatoes, carrots, bread with butter, milk, and for dessert, canned peaches and syrup. Otto stared at his tray. This was more food than he had seen in a single meal since 1943. He picked up his spoon and hesitated, half expecting someone to snatch the tray away, to laugh and say it was a joke, that prisoners did not eat like this. No one snatched it away. He ate slowly, forcing himself not to gulp, not to make himself sick. Around him, other boys were doing the same, some eating methodically, others weeping quietly as they chewed. Franz, sitting across from him, looked up with wet eyes and whispered, "This can't be true." "It's true," Otto said. "Why?" Otto had no answer. He only knew that the world had split into two incomprehensible halves. The Germany he had left, where everything was broken, and this place where everything worked. And he did not understand how both could exist simultaneously. The philosophy behind Canada's treatment of POWs, including child soldiers, was rooted in pragmatism as much as morality. A directive issued by the Department of National Defense in 1943 stated, "Prisoners are to be housed, fed, and employed in accordance with the Geneva Convention." Harsh treatment serves no strategic purpose and risks retaliation against Canadian prisoners held by the enemy. Security, diplomacy, morality. The triad was clear. Canada had agreed to take custody of tens of thousands of German prisoners to relieve pressure on overcrowded British camps, and in doing so, it committed to upholding international law even when the enemy had not. For the boys, this policy translated into something they had not expected: routine, predictability, the absence of arbitrary cruelty. They were woken at 6, fed at 7, assigned to work details at 8. The work was not brutal, clearing brush, repairing fences, tending gardens that supplied the camp's kitchen. They worked until noon, broke for lunch, worked until 4, then had the evening free. There were no beatings. No punishments beyond temporary confinement for those who broke camp rules. No starvation rations or forced marches or casual violence. It was, Otto realized, more humane than the Hitler youth camps he had attended as a child. Life in the camp developed its own rhythm. Otto was assigned to a barracks with 20 other boys, all of them between 14 and 17, all of them trying to make sense of captivity that felt less like imprisonment and more like limbo. They were not free. But they were not being destroyed. They existed in a strange in-between state, waiting for a future that none of them could imagine. In the evenings, after work and dinner, the boys gathered in the recreation hall. There was a piano, battered, out of tune but functional, and someone had found sheet music for German folk songs. They sang sometimes, hesitant at first, then with more confidence as the weeks passed. They played cards. They read books from the camp library, which had a surprising collection of German-language novels. They wrote letters home, though no one knew if the letters would ever be delivered, or if there was anyone left to receive them. Otto wrote to his mother every Sunday. He kept the letters brief, factual. I am in Canada. I am safe. The food is adequate. I am learning English. I hope you are well. He did not mention the fear. He did not mention the guilt, the gnawing sense that he was living in comfort while Germany burned. He did not mention that he woke sometimes in the night and heard the phantom sound of artillery, felt the phantom cold of the boxcar, tasted the phantom dust of Königsberg. He simply wrote that he was safe, and hoped it was true. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. One afternoon in late July, a Canadian guard named Corporal MacDonald approached Otto during a work detail. MacDonald was in his 30s, a farmer from Saskatchewan who had enlisted in 1942 and been assigned to guard duty rather than combat. He spoke no German, but he had learned a few phrases and he used them now. We get ESDIR? How are you? Otto looked up, surprised. Gut, he said automatically. Good. MacDonald smiled. He pulled a photograph from his pocket and showed it to Otto. It was a picture of a farmhouse, a woman standing on the porch, 2 children sitting on the steps. Home, MacDonald said. Saskatchewan. Otto studied the photograph. Then he pulled his own photograph from his wallet, a creased, faded image of his mother standing in front of their apartment building in Berlin. Mean mutter, he said. My mother. MacDonald looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he handed it back carefully and said in halting German, I hope she is safe. Otto felt something crack inside him, not breaking exactly but shifting. For months, he had carried the belief that Canadians saw him as an enemy, as something less than human. But MacDonald's words were not the words of someone who hated. They were the words of someone who understood that Otto was not a soldier by choice, that he was a boy who missed his mother, that the war had stolen from him as much as it had stolen from anyone. It was a small gesture. A photograph. A few kind words. But it punctured the armor Otto had built, and for the first time since his capture, he allowed himself to feel something other than fear or numbness. He felt hope. Fragile. Tentative. But real. Not all the boys adapted easily. There were hardliners. Teenagers who clung to the ideology they had been taught, who refused to accept that they had been lied to, who believed that Germany would rise again and that surrender was betrayal. They were a minority, perhaps 10%, but they were loud. They harassed boys who fraternized with guards. They held secret meetings where they sang Nazi anthems and swore oaths to a regime that no longer existed. They were angry not just at the Allies but at the world for proving them wrong. Otto avoided them. He had believed once or thought he had. But belief required certainty and he had none left. He had seen too much. The chaos of retreat, the collapse of command, the lies told by officers who abandoned their men and fled west. He had been promised victory and given annihilation. And now, sitting in a Canadian POW camp eating beef stew and learning English, he could not reconcile the propaganda with the reality. One evening, a boy named Heinrich, 17 from Hamburg, a fervent believer, confronted Otto in the barracks. You're forgetting who you are, Heinrich said. I know exactly who I am, Otto replied. I'm a prisoner. So are you. We're soldiers. We're children, Otto said. They dressed us up and sent us to die. And when we didn't die they sent us here. That's all we are. Heinrich's face flushed with anger. But he said nothing. Because deep down Otto suspected he knew it was true. In August, the camp organized a birthday celebration for one of the boys, Franz, turning 17. The guards allowed the prisoners to bake a cake using supplies from the kitchen, and that evening after dinner, they gathered in the recreation hall and sang. Not Nazi songs. Not propaganda. Just, "Happy Birthday," in German, followed by folk songs that had nothing to do with war or ideology. Just songs about rivers and mountains and home. Franz stood in the center of the room, surrounded by boys who had become something like brothers, and for a moment the weight of the war lifted. They were not soldiers. Not prisoners. Just boys celebrating a birthday in the only way they could. Corporal MacDonald stood near the door watching. When the singing ended, he approached Franz and handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a chocolate bar, Canadian, sweet, wrapped in foil. "Happy birthday," MacDonald said. Franz stared at the chocolate. Then he looked up at MacDonald and said in broken English, "Thank you." It was the first time Otto had heard Franz speak English. It was also the first time he had seen him smile. The war in Europe had ended in May, but the boys did not learn this until weeks later. News traveled slowly to the camp, filtered through Canadian censors and delivered in sanitized summaries. When they were finally told, gathered in the mess hall, a translator reading from a prepared statement, the reaction was muted. No cheers. No tears. Just silence, heavy and complicated. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The Reich had collapsed. And the boys, sitting in a camp in northern Ontario, felt nothing but confusion. What did victory or defeat mean when you were 16 and had lost everything? Otto thought about his mother. About his father. About the apartment in Berlin that was probably rubble. About the future that had been promised to him, glory, honor, a 1,000-year empire, and the future he had instead, captivity, uncertainty, a world that no longer made sense. He thought, we were supposed to win. We were told we would win. And now we're here. Repatriation began in the autumn of 1946. The process was slow, bureaucratic, hampered by the chaos of post-war Europe. The boys were screened, interviewed, assessed for their level of indoctrination and the likelihood they would reintegrate into civilian life. Some were sent back to Germany immediately. Others were held longer, deemed too sympathetic to Nazi ideology to be released safely. Otto was cleared in November. He boarded a ship in Halifax, the same harbor where he had arrived 18 months earlier, and sailed back across the Atlantic. The crossing was rough, the ship crowded with repatriated prisoners, all of them silent, all of them staring at the horizon and wondering what they would find when they arrived. Germany was unrecognizable. Berlin was divided, occupied, a ghost of itself. Otto's apartment building was gone, destroyed in the final Soviet assault. His mother was alive, living in a refugee shelter in the western sector. His father had died at Stalingrad in 1943. Otto found his mother in December. She was thinner, grayer, older than he remembered. But she was alive. They sat in a cold, crowded room and held each other and did not speak, because words could not bridge the distance between who they had been and who they had become. Later she asked, "What was it like? In Canada?" Otto thought about the camp. About the food. About Corporal MacDonald and the photograph. About Franz's birthday and the chocolate bar. About the strange, disorienting kindness that had met him when he expected only cruelty. "It was better than I deserved," he said. By 1950, Otto had built a new life. He worked as a carpenter, married a schoolteacher, had 2 children. He never spoke about the war unless asked, and even then his answers were brief, stripped of detail. But he kept one thing, a photograph of Corporal MacDonald's farmhouse, given to him on the day he left the camp. On the back in pencil MacDonald had written, "Good luck. Remember kindness." Otto kept it in a drawer. Sometimes, late at night, he would take it out and stare at it and think about the boy he had been, terrified, indoctrinated, convinced he was going to die in a frozen labor camp. And he would think about the Canadian soldier who had shown him a photograph of home and said in broken German, "I hope she is safe." He thought, the war taught me to hate. A stranger taught me I was wrong. If this story moved you, subscribe, because the battles that define us aren't always fought with bullets, and the victories that last aren't always written in history books. The camp in northern Ontario was decommissioned in 1947. The barracks were dismantled, the land returned to forest. There is no plaque, no memorial, nothing to mark that it existed. The boys who lived there scattered. Some stayed in Canada, some returned to Germany, some disappeared into the anonymity of post-war displacement. Their stories were not recorded. History had no space for child soldiers who survived. But Otto remembered. And in remembering, he carried a truth that the war had tried to destroy, that decency is not weakness. That mercy extended to the undeserving is not wasted. That kindness, offered at the right moment, can reshape a life. The boys had expected punishment. They had been taught that enemies were cruel, that defeat meant suffering, that surrender meant death. They had braced for all of it. Instead they received soup, and blankets, and birthday cakes, and photographs of farmhouses in Saskatchewan, and the slow, disorienting realization that the people they had been told to hate were not monsters. They were just people, doing the hard, unglamorous work of remaining human in a world that rewarded cruelty. The war had taught them fear. Canada taught them that fear was a lie. And the distance between those two lessons, the gap between expectation and reality, was the space where Otto learned to be something other than a soldier. He learned to be a boy again. And then, slowly, a man. They braced for savagery. The first thing they tasted was white bread. And that simple reversal, that ordinary miracle, reminds us that civilization is not a monument. It is a choice. Made once and then again until the choosing itself becomes who you are.